welcome everybody to the third Handbook webinar. So today we have Sarah Knox and Clara Hill on training and supervision. To remind people maybe who haven't joined previous webinars, this is a sort of a joint venture in combination with APA Division 29 and with CEPI. So we're delighted to welcome members from those organizations. Just a word to say in terms of background. Both Clara Hill and Sarah wrote a chapter in the 6th edition of the handbook, and in the 7th one, they revisited it and switched in a crossover design authorship for Sarah and then Clara. The other thing to say is that Wolfgang, Louis, and myself noted that in the previous handbook, their chapter was placed last in the handbook. I guess one chapter has to come last. But anyway, we thought we wanted to kind of show the centrality of training and supervision. So in fact, in the 7th edition, we placed it sort of somewhat in the center under therapeutic ingredients as a way of trying to really say how important this area of work is. I'd like also just take a few moments just to recognition of the huge contribution that Clara has made to the handbook. She's contributed to 4 editions of the handbook to date, first of all in conjunction with Michael Lambert, and then subsequently with Sarah Knox. And also for those people who've been asleep for the last couple of years or whatever, to note that her huge endeavor on psychotherapy skills and methods that work together with John Norcross is to be published next month, I think, or is it July? Oh, that is next month. No, it's not. It's the one after the one coming. Okay, so anyway, there you go. So it's a huge thank you to both Sarah and to Clara for presenting this webinar. And I think the expression is over to you.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate that very much. And Clara and I just wanted to extend our welcome to everyone who's attending and our appreciation for your carving out an hour or so of your busy time today to hear what we know about training and supervision. So thanks again. So one of the first questions is, well, why would we want even to do a chapter on training and supervision? Well, clearly, when students are training to be therapists, they spend up to 7 years, it could be, learning how to be therapists. And that process typically involves both clinical training and also supervision related to that training. So clearly, we think that training and supervision are important. They're vital parts of the whole process that one goes through in order to become a therapist. So if they're that important, we would hope that we have some considerable and solid evidence about the efficacy of those training efforts. However, the evidence we have is actually remarkably scant. So one of the ulterior motives to this chapter is to try to spur more and better research by reviewing what we do and what we don't know about these two endeavors of training and supervision. We also want to note that our focus today is going to be on undergraduate and graduate level trainees. So just kind of know going in, that's what the research that we focused on is focusing on as well. So by way of definitions up front, we define training as activities that are structured educational activities for groups of trainees. Supervision, then, we defined as an individualized process of one supervisor working with one supervisee regarding specific clients. So we did not include in this particular chapter group supervision, informal supervision, peer supervision, things like that.
So, hello, everybody. I'm pleased to be here with Sarah to present. Very excited about this. I've been involved in training and supervision for well over 50 years now. And I'm very passionate about training and supervision. I think it's very important the way we train and supervise. Most theoretical orientations have their own approach to training. Most programs, most people, we all have our own way of doing it. There's been some empirical efforts. A few of the, in terms of empathy, facilitative conditions, alliance training, self-awareness training, psychodynamic interpersonal, experiential, behavioral, all of them have published some efforts on what this training is all about. But most of them are not programmatic research. They're usually one or two more, maybe sometimes 3 or 4 studies, but there's not much effort in this area for really programmatic research. So I'm going to focus in this section on helping skills training, primarily because it's what I'm most familiar with, but also to show a model for how a research program can unfold. Not that it's the best way necessarily, but it's certainly one that I know something about. The theoretical model for helping skills training is based on Rogers. Way back, Rogers started his career talking about how paraphrases show clients that you hear what they're saying. He really advocated mirroring, client-centered approach, and talked about how if you let clients know you're listening and hearing and understanding, they're empowered to come up with their own ideas and their own insights. You don't have to help them do that. They do that on their own. We're there to help them get there, not to do it for them. And initially, he thought that the skills, such as restatements, reflections, and feelings, were the key things and that those could be taught. Now, he came later in his career to saying it wasn't the skills, it was more the facilitative conditions. But many people took off on his idea of skills and developed many training programs to help students learn the skills. The prominent ones among those were human relations training and micro-counseling, both of which teach specific micro skills in a systematic format. Also, interpersonal process recall basically is formatted on the notion that you first learn the skills and then you learn what are the barriers to using the skills. In a large meta-analysis way back, Baker compared these 3 models, found a large effect size for human relations training, a moderate effect size for micro-counseling, and a small effect size for interpersonal process recall. Now, there's a lot of problems with this body of research, many problems. I'm just going to highlight a couple. One is that the training generally was very short. And one of the reasons that maybe the human relations training had more effect was because it was a little bit longer, more like 20 hours. So that's a real problem because most of the time, as I'll talk later, the training needs to be a lot longer than that, obviously, for people to really begin to incorporate. Even the 60 hours that we generally do is a drop in the bucket compared to what people really need. The other thing is most of the research was based on a train them to the test kind of model, so that you think reflections are important. So you ask them at the beginning, can you do a reflection? They can't. So then you teach them exactly how to do a reflection. And then voila, by the end, they can do a reflection. Does that say they can do it with a client? No. So at least those are 2 of the biggest of the many problems with it. But what we did was based on, I learned helping skills in my graduate program and basically learned it based on Kharkov. And since then, I've developed and keep on modifying the approach to helping skills, and have also developed a way of studying it. The approach basically is 3 stages: exploration based on client-centered, where you have clients tell their story, and you do that through restatement, reflection, support, listening. And then you move to insight, which is based on psychodynamic theory, in which you help clients figure out why it is that they do what they do through immediacy, challenges, and interpretations. And then once people have some foundation of why they do what they do, you move to action in terms of helping them figure out what they need to do differently in their lives. Okay, so the overall goals of training are to increase listening. So much of the time people come into these helping skills program, they're used to friendships where hopefully it's a 50-50 kind of thing, and they have to learn to listen more. Typically, therapy is more like 80% listening, 20% responding. So it's very different from friendship. The appropriate use of skills, obviously, we want to teach them, and we teach them professionalism. We teach them how to be therapists, kind of the demeanor of being therapists. We also want to decrease their number of words. Again, not talking as much, decrease interruptions, hopefully decrease their anxiety and their inappropriate use of skills, like too much promiscuous self-disclosure, too much premature advice. And big thing, overall, we stress flexibility and responsiveness. So it's not like there's one right skill. It's more like, what's going on at the time? What does the client need? What did you do? And how does the client respond? So that's what we're really aiming for rather than a cookbook kind of approach. So we've had 4 major questions in our helping skills training. And the first one I'm going to focus on is helping skills training effective for novice or undergraduate trainees especially? Let me just tell you about kind of a study, in my mind at least, a landmark study, one of our first big attempts to look at the helping skills effectiveness. We tried to correct a lot of the problems in previous research by using multiple measures rather than just empathy, for example, multiple perspectives rather than just helpee or help the client perspective. We used also, one of the big problems in previous research was they did one class with one instructor. So in this case, we had 85 undergraduate students nested within 3 instructors or classes. Importantly, in the class, they had a 20-minute session at the beginning with one classmate and a 20-minute session in mid-semester after they had learned the exploration skills. And admittedly, it's with classmates, but at least they were talking about real concerns. In addition, they rated their confidence in their skills after each lab. They had the way the course was structured, they had a 2-hour lecture every week and a 2-hour lab. And at the end of each lab, they rated how self-confident they were in the skill they were learning that week. At the end of the semester, they completed a current and retrospective pre-estimate of their self-efficacy for using helping skills. So one of the things we realized as we were getting into this is that you can't really rate self-efficacy at the beginning because you don't know what you're rating. You don't know what the helping skills are. So how can you say how much self-efficacy you have before you know what you're rating? So at the end of the semester, and there's some nice research that actually shows that this works, you rate what you were previously and what you are now. So in essence, we're rating the estimate of how much they changed rather than how much they actually changed. So the results of this study were there in that second session compared to the first. Helpees, or the clients, we call them helpees rather than clients because they're really volunteer clients. But again, they were talking about real problems. They said the therapist or helper had more self-efficacy for using the helping skills. The helpers themselves rated themselves higher on empathy, expertness, attractiveness, and trustworthiness in that second session. Exploration skills, which was what we were focused on, as judged by helpees, helpers, and observers, the real actual performance of the exploration skills was judged as increased. And session quality as judged by helpers and helpers was increased. And they reduced the number of words. In addition, in terms of those self-confidence ratings, they increased after exploration skills training. They actually decreased after insight skills training, which we explained because most people know the exploration skills, restatement and reflections, questions, are things they do in everyday life. They just have to hone them a little bit. But insight skills are really difficult. They're not things therapists, that friends usually use. You don't really challenge your friends that much. You don't usually use immediacy in relationships. So it's not surprising that these decreased, confidence decreased, and indeed I can talk about later if you want. These skills are ones that people don't even master until many, many years later. But again, during action skills, they increase their confidence once again because these skills are a little bit more common and easy to use. In another study, we wanted to know, well, not just is helping skills training effective, but are the skills maintained? Just like we look at follow-up in psychotherapy, we would really like to know, is it just they can learn the skills and at the end of the semester, great, but do they keep them later? And so we contacted, from a study we had done in 2014, we contacted students 5 years later. Hard to get a hold of them, but we managed to get a hold of quite a few. And we asked them to fill out the self-efficacy measure again. Basically, self-efficacy maintained over 5 years. And students continued to use the helping skills both professionally and in personal relationships. And I really like this one in personal relationships, because what many students have told us is that they not only learned the skills and learned how to use them in a helping setting, but they apply them to use with friends. They began to listen more with friends. They began to ask them questions rather than telling them what to do so quickly. And in fact, many of our students have said everybody ought to take a course in helping skills because they really learn how to communicate better. Very interestingly, the students who continued on in graduate studies scored higher in self-efficacy than their counterparts. So it really looked like continued practice. And I'm going to come back to that theme about practice later, but very importantly, if you keep practicing, your self-efficacy keeps increasing. Whereas if you don't practice, it doesn't increase as much. So kind of given those two studies, this highlights kind of a narrative review of this literature. There were 9 studies with undergraduate students, 5 studies with beginning graduate students. In 9 out of the 9 studies, they reported increased self-efficacy. It was actually more for undergraduate than graduate students, which I think is very understandable because undergraduates have further to go. They're just changing from relating to people on a friendship basis to becoming professionals. And that's when you see, I think, the biggest increase in training. And I think explains why a lot of times training for professionals or other people, you don't see as dramatic results as you see in this helping skills literature. Graduate students often have already had helping skills training, so they don't have as far to change. But the undergraduates, it's remarkable. At the end of the semester, you just see this transformation that's just lovely to witness. They also, when we actually measured their performance of helping skills, again, in 8 out of 8 studies, there were increases. And more specifically, exploration skills increased, insight skills increased, and they spoke fewer words. In addition, we've looked at a lot of other measures of outcomes, 1 study each, so we can't really make big statements, but they've increased in ethnocultural empathy, attitudes towards seeking psychological help, decreases in anxiety and stigma for psychological help seeking. And as I mentioned, skills maintained over 5 years and no evidence of adverse effects or harm. So our second question, if we know it's effective, what are the effective components? So most of the previous studies were of overall training programs. They didn't look at components. It's more of this black box, you do training for 60 hours, whatever, but who knows what's effective. And there's lots of ways you could begin to tackle this. But here's where we went with it. Oh, the other thing is most of these programs were on exploration skills and empathy. So what we said is, what do we know about the components for insight skills? Given that mentioned just previously, it's the insight skills are really the ones that are hard to measure, hard to train on, hard to learn. And so, and when we're talking about insight skills, again, it's immediacy, or talking about the therapy relationship in the here and now, you and me, I and thou. Challenges, which are pointing out discrepancies, raising self-awareness, giving a discrepant point of view, and interpretations, or going beyond what they're knowing, looking for patterns or meaning. The theoretical foundation for these components is based on Bandura's notion of what's important for learning in terms of instruction, modeling, practice, and feedback. Instruction involves things like reading and lectures. Modeling involves things like watching experts or peers do the skills. Practice involves multiple things of hopefully interacting with a standardized patient, an avatar, group practice, individuals. And feedback, of course, refers to getting feedback on how well you're doing the skills. So here we did 3 different studies. In each study, there were at least 100 undergraduate trainees with at least 3 instructors. After they learn the exploration skills, and I make that a very important caveat, you can't teach the insight skills without a foundation in exploration skills. It would be ludicrous to try to learn immediacy, challenge, or interpretation until they know some foundational skills. And half the group were assigned to immediate training and the other half to delayed or 2 weeks later. In other words, they learned another skill first. So it wasn't like they were just sitting waiting. They were learning some other skill. Half of them get one, half of them get the other. In each study, they first did the reading, and then they rated their self-efficacy for doing the skill. Then they heard a lecture, did self-efficacy ratings. They saw a video model, then did self-efficacy ratings. And then they practiced in a variety of formats, and after each one, rated self-efficacy. The feedback, unfortunately, was informal because we couldn't figure out a way to do it with so many people in such a large classes. Across all 3 studies, there were increases in self-efficacy for using the target skill. And the trainees in the delay condition did not increase in self-efficacy for that skill until after the training. So we had clear evidence from control groups that the self-efficacy really did increase. And it looked like we had substantial support for instruction, modeling, practice, and feedback. And again, I said the feedback was informal, but they still said feedback was important in their qualitative feedback. But what's most interesting, and I really want to highlight this, is trainees consistently rated practice as the most effective. They said things like, well, the reading was nice. They read my book. They said it was nice. They thought it was actually very easy to do these skills after they read the book, but they weren't really able to do the skill after they read the book. Same with modeling. It looked great. They loved seeing the models doing the skills, but they didn't learn how to do them. It was when they actually started practicing, especially with the real volunteer who was talking about real problems, they could really see what was working. They could observe the impact of the skill. And because they were working with classmates, when they were the clients, they could see the effect of the skill being used on them. So it was really the practice that made the most impact. And they really said that's the only way they could learn it was the practice. So next we move to, can we predict who will benefit from training? And this is important because some trainees might be better than others at learning the skills. And if we knew who was better at it, we could modify the training programs to fit individual trainee needs. And we could select trainees from graduate programs who could learn the skills more. Wouldn't that be lovely? Unfortunately, we had no consistent evidence of the predictors, even though several have been studied. For example, empathy. Didn't make any difference who was deemed more empathic in terms of Tim Anderson's facilitative intervention scale. Now, it may be the self-selection is a problem because all these people who go into helping skills classes voluntarily go in. They don't have to go in. It's not a random group. So it may be that if we had a bunch of engineering students that we did helping skills training with, maybe that would make more of a difference, what their facilitative skills were like. So it may be self-selection, or maybe it's that everybody can benefit somehow from helping skills training. We don't know. Are there instructor effect? I was very impressed by psychotherapist effects in psychotherapy. Michael's done a lot of work on that. So does it make a difference who the instructors are, the lab leaders? And remember, most of the early research I said was done with one class with one instructor, and then they said it was effective. But that could be just because those instructors so adamantly believed in their method that they encouraged people. So we had, at this point, we had to do the study over 2 years with over 20 different lab sections, learning helping skills. Fortunately, University of Maryland, there's a lot of sections of people learning helping skills every semester, so we're very lucky to be able to do that. 7% of the variance in changes in self-efficacy was based on the lab leaders. I think that's pretty impressive. We tried to look at predictors for which lab leaders were better. And the one that did turn out was authoritative teaching style. In other words, people who set appropriate expectations and fostered communications. Those were the lab leaders that had better outcomes. Whereas facilitative interpersonal skills were not associated. My explanation for that is that these were instructors. They weren't actually doing a lot of modeling. They were more instructing a class. So it may not be, if they had been the ones being the helper, maybe that would have been more, but that wasn't the teaching style that worked. So the takeaway, helping skills training is effective. It's empirically supported. Increased self-efficacy for using skills, increased exploration insight skills, reductions in talk time, maintain skills after 5 years, instruction, modeling, practice, feedback, all effective, practice most effective. We cannot predict which trainees will benefit. The instructor affects 7%. So I think those are some pretty good takeaway messages, but lots to be done in the future. It's very difficult to study this because, like I said, you need a lot of, in most graduate courses, you have 4 or 5 students who come in a year with one instructor. Very hard to do that unless you have a lot of multi-site kind of things, which I think is a very exciting way to go with this. But we definitely need more research to determine what makes training effective and to develop better training programs. Most of this research in our program, at least, has been done in our lab. It needs to be replicated by others who may not believe in it as fervently as we do. Very important that we need to nest trainees under instructors' classes and have large enough samples to determine trainer and trainee effects. We need to study effects on real clients after training. I mentioned that most of this was with volunteer classmates who, they're learning the skills at the same time, so it really could make a big difference. The real proof of the pudding, as Sarah will talk about in supervision, is are they better to work with clients? One of the things that we found in the class that we didn't study so far is reviewing the transcripts. We required that students, for one of their sessions, transcribe everything and then go back and code the helping skills that they used and also say what skill would have been better. And then we have an instructor go back over the entire transcript and, as if they're supervising, make sure they coded it right and also give other ideas for what they could have done. And even though students actually at the beginning hate doing those transcripts, when they finally get the feedback about what skills they did and what they could have done, they think that's one of the most valuable things. So that, I think, would be a really nice area for research. I mentioned several times how important practice is. It'd be really interesting to study different kinds of practice. Practice with avatars, practice with written forms of feedback, our clients' statements, practice with real clients, practice with classmates. Which of those forms of practice is the most effective? We need to include other kind of possible outcomes. I mentioned changes in outside relationships. I'd like to study that more clearly. I'd like to see how they actually interact differently in their outside world. I'd like to see how they develop their personal theoretical orientation and style more. We need to compare this to other training models. Like I said, this is just one training model. How does it compare to others? I'd like to also study the trajectory of trainees who do and do not participate in helping skills training, because I think, based on my personal experience and based on when our trainees go out to internships, etc., they often say that compared to their counterparts who have never had helping skills training, how much more advanced they are, how much more they feel like therapists, how better they are prepared. But we don't have any evidence of that. Are they really better prepared? Do other people catch up based on just practice with real clients? So we need to know much more about that. And that's it for me. So Sarah, your turn.
Sure. Thank you, Clara. So my section is going to focus on what we know about individual supervision and its effectiveness. And again, we're just reminding you, we're focusing on students who are either undergraduate or graduate students. Next slide, Clara.
Oh, right.
And again, much as I mentioned earlier, despite the central role of supervision and how we develop trainees, we have actually little evidence of its effectiveness And if it's effective, we don't have a whole lot of evidence about what might contribute to that effectiveness. So the two undergirding questions here for this section of the presentation is, first, is supervision effective? And if it is, what might make it effective? And before we get into the nitty-gritty of the research, it's really important that we acknowledge up front that there's a fairly strong and healthy debate about, well, whose outcome should be assessed? Should we look at the effects of supervision on supervisees? They're the ones who are directly receiving supervision, so it makes sense to spend some time looking at, well, how does supervision affect supervisees? But there's also a very reasonable argument to be made that we should be studying the effects of supervision on clients, because that's what this whole training process is about, of how can we train students to be of best help to clients and to support their increased well-being. So those are the two sources of debate here in terms of, should the outcomes be assessed in supervisees or should be assessed on clients? Occasionally someone will talk about, well, maybe we need to look at the effects of supervision on supervisors. Makes sense, but there's actually little, if any, research on that component. So in examining that first question, is supervision effective? Well, to answer that question, we would really need to conduct experimental studies. And in doing that, randomly assign trainees to a condition in which they received supervision and one in which they did not receive supervision, and then take a look at the effects, again, either on the supervisees themselves or on the clients. In our review of the literature, we found one study that did that, Bambling et al. In 2006, but their sample was post-degree therapists, so we have not included that research in this presentation. So what we're left then is the need to rely on the existing correlational or naturalistic studies of the effects of supervision on supervisees. And so this first section of this part of the presentation is going to look at, what do we know about the effects of supervision on supervisees? Well, we actually have fairly good evidence that supervision has mostly positive effects on supervisees. And the specific types of those effects are in the parentheses below there. It increases their self-awareness, their awareness of others. It increases their sense of autonomy, motivation, and self-efficacy. They tend to have very positive feelings about supervisors and their supervision process. They increase in their insight and in their clarity about the clinical work. So a range of positive effects of supervision on supervisees. Less often, but certainly worthy of concern, we find that supervision has neutral or negative effects on supervisees. More specifically, it tends to lower, it may lower their self-efficacy. Supervisees talked about the fear of evaluation. They describe difficult relationships with supervisors and impaired work with clients, ruptures in the supervision process, and then negative feelings about supervisor style and interventions. So that the first section was looking at, is supervision effective for supervisees? What do we know about the effectiveness of supervision for clients or supervisors? We found only one study that actually looked at the effects of supervision on clients. And this study found that supervision had a moderate effect on client outcome. We found no studies that looked at the effects of supervisions on supervisors. Limitations of this research. In some ways, they echo what Clara talked about, limitations of that research. In some ways, unique or distinct limitations here. Lack of control groups, and with that, a lack of random assignment. In many cases, it was a single agency that was used for data collection. The participants tended to be fairly homogeneous, as more specifically, they tended to be white women. Often only one perspective, and usually that was the supervisee. Only the supervisee's perspective was collected in the data. And there was really no way to determine the source of any of these effects. When supervisees are in supervision, not only are they in individual supervision, but they're also often in group supervision, or they may engage in informal or peer supervision. We also don't know whether the effects came from the supervision, from the supervisors, or, as Clara was mentioning in her section, the huge impact of practicing therapy. Well, simply by virtue of the fact that they're actually practicing and providing therapy, that could also have an impact here as well. And there's no way to tease that apart currently. Finally, because these were not experimental studies, there's no way we can make any type of causal assertion as to the source of these effects. So if we have at least some evidence that supervision by and large tends to have more positive than negative effects on supervisees, now we need to ask the question, well, what might contribute to those effects? And so first, looking at supervisee variables that might be associated with supervision outcomes on supervisees. 3 studies looked at attachment, and they found that when supervisees are securely attached to their supervisor, that was linked with more supervisee self-disclosure in supervision, with a supervisor being experienced as helpful, and with a strong supervisory working alliance. In contrast, kind of makes sense. Avoidant or more fearfully attached supervisees to supervisor was linked with poor supervision working alliance and a weaker sense of supervisee self-efficacy. A couple of other studies looked at different at non-attachment features of supervisees. One study looked at supervisees' internal representations of supervisors. And by that, that means sort of how does the supervisee carry around the presence of the supervisor with them between supervision sessions? So it could be they sort of had a visual image of the supervisor with them that was present with them. It could be that they heard things that the supervisor had said, more of a verbal type of internal rep. Or it could be more of a felt presence of these supervisors. They're sort of, they sense that the supervisor was with them. So those are internal representations. Another study looked at supervisee openness to experience, and both the internal reps and supervisee openness to experience did yield positive findings. More specifically, supervisees were more satisfied. They stated that they had a better understanding of their clients, the supervision alliance was stronger, and they felt that they were more able to meet their clients' needs. Now switching our focus from supervisee variables to supervisor variables, what types of supervisor variables might be associated with supervision outcomes? And again, the outcome is for supervisees. 4 studies took a look at different supervisor personal traits, more specifically openness, credibility, and mindfulness, and found that those traits by and large were linked with positive outcomes. Supervisees felt more satisfied, achieved insight, felt more confident, more comfortable. They felt that their work with their clients had been improved, and they talked about having a stronger supervision relationship. Some studies have also looked at what skills supervisors actually use. And 5 studies looked at supervisors' use of basic skills. And by that, we mean things like normalizing, teaching, supporting, giving feedback, challenging the supervisees, and also supervisors engaging in self-disclosure and immediacy. Those basic skills were linked with mostly positive outcomes, similar to those above under the personal traits. Sometimes, though, the supervisor basic skills were linked with less positive outcomes. For example, supervisees felt confused or discouraged. So by and large, use of basic skills seemed to lead to positive outcomes. Some additional supervisor variables, basic skills we talked about in the previous slide. Well, what happens when supervisors use more advanced skills, such as maintaining boundaries, engaging in positive boundary crossings, or attending to parallel process? Those 2 were also often linked with positive things like supervisees feeling that they were growing, they were satisfied with supervision, there was a strong supervision relationship, they felt less anxious, and they felt that their work with their clients had actually improved as well. There's some evidence that when supervisors make errors in their techniques, such as really not giving a whole lot of input as part of the supervision process, in the form of engaging in gender discrimination or not adhering to ethical guidelines. No surprise here, those tended to be linked with more negative types of outcomes. Supervisees felt discouraged, felt negative emotions, were less satisfied and less involved in the supervision, and they reported a weaker supervision alliance. One study looked at supervisors' use of cultural humility, and that was positively linked with supervisee satisfaction. So we've looked at supervisee variables, we looked at supervisor variables, and now we're looking at supervision relationship variables. 4 studies we found here. And here we found that when supervisees perceived a strong supervision working alliance that predicted reduced supervisee anxiety, more supervisee willingness to disclose in supervision, and greater supervisee self-efficacy. Finally, then, we've looked at supervisees, supervisors, the relationship. Well, what about the triad? In the supervision process, there are at least 3 people present: the supervisor, the supervisee, and the client. And so what do we know about the effect of the triad on supervision outcome? We found only 2 studies here, and in one, the supervision alliance, as perceived by both supervisor and supervisee, was positively linked with the client-related working alliance and session evaluation. So here we have kind of a trickle-down effect of the super alliance. If that's in good shape, that seemed to be related to the client's sense of the working alliance in therapy and the session evaluation. And then finally, in one study, supervisors talked about their supervisors having a major and positive impact on helping them work with a specific client that they were really struggling with. So what's the takeaway message from the supervision literature then? Well, sound attachment, good, strong attachment of the supervisee to the supervisor, and probably related to that, a strong supervision working alliance seemed to be vital. They likely provide a secure base for the inevitable struggles that supervisees experience. So that relationship is key. Supervisors' personal traits, their empathic attunement to the supervision working alliance, their use of both basic and advanced supervision skills, and their giving supervisees feedback about their client progress were also related to positive findings. The limitations of this research are exactly parallel to what they were in the first chunk of research that I talked about. No control groups, single agencies to collect data, homogeneous participants, only one perspective, not able to determine the source of these effects, and no causal assertions. So what would future research ideally look like? Well, ideally, we could actually include control groups so that we could begin to make some causal claims about the effects of supervision. But we have to acknowledge that that may not be ethically feasible because we can't allow trainees to be seeing clients without supervision. So we may well continue to need to rely on correlational studies, but we can make those stronger. For example, we could collect data from multiple settings as opposed to the single setting that characterized much of this research. We could collect data from multiple perspectives. Again, in opposition to the single perspective, usually the supervisee, that characterized much of the existing research. We can improve the psychometrics of the existing measures that are out there. It's also important to recognize that any effects of supervision on clients, remember that first thing I talked about is where should we assess outcome, on supervisees or clients? Well, any effect of supervision on clients are going to be nested within supervisees, who are themselves then nested within supervisors. So we likely need to use more complex designs, multi-level modeling with large samples to try to get at some of these effects. I mentioned earlier that supervisees are certainly in formal supervision, but they also engage in sort of spontaneous, peer, or informal supervision. Very little has taken a look at that. What are the effects of informal supervision on supervisees and then on their work with clients? It's also hugely important that we acknowledge that supervisees choose whom they talk about in supervision. So what effect does that have on supervisees and on their work with clients? Do clients about whom supervisees do talk in supervision, are the effects on those clients different from the effects on clients that supervisees choose not to discuss? We don't know right now. And then finally, very little of the research has taken a look at culture and how that might affect the supervision process and outcome. So that is our summary of the existing research on training and supervision. Again, we thank you very much. And at this point, we welcome any comments or questions that you might have.
Hi, it's Michael here. If I can ask a question, which will be quite predictable, actually. I mean, it applies to both presentations because you both identified it in terms of the need for sort of large-scale studies. but rather than just stating the obvious, as kind of my perspective was one of, do you not both feel somewhat kind of frustrated that, I mean, I don't know how it works in the US, but presumably there's a Division 29 or there's some coordination of training. You know, I wonder why it hasn't been possible for organizations, training programs to get together and say, look, training, skills, etc., is just fundamental. And the best service we can pay is really to get together and just do a national study or something that actually uses all our resources. You know, in a sense, it's like developing a PRN for training supervision, so that you end up with sufficiently large samples, including diversity and all the issues that you have kind of quite rightly addressed, to get some sort of, to move the field on, because it feels like what you have are these really interesting, dare I say it, but small scale studies that sort of show promise. But to get to a national stage where you're training the next generation of practitioners, it feels like the research really has to kind of shift, you know, in terms of that spread, but then also, as you said, building in the nested nature to find out who are the good trainers, because, you know, you can have training programs all over the country, but if your trainers, half your trainers aren't very good, then it's, you know, so those are my two thoughts really, which apply both to sort of both aspects of the presentation really. So I suppose I'm feeling, if I were in your position, somewhat frustrated by, are you hitting a block? Is there no interest in actually taking this forward at a national level?
You're absolutely right. I mean, you've identified it. There is no interest in it. What we've done is we've moved on beyond that to say, well, here's the competencies, here's the benchmarks, here's what we want people to do. So we're going to implement all these competencies in our accreditation guidelines and force people to do these things and these things with no empirical evidence. So, I mean, it's absolutely backwards that people just go on and say, here's what needs to be done with no evidence. I mean, I'm just appalled at the state of the art. And they're saying things that should be done that shouldn't be done. So why? Because it takes a lot of work. I mean, to do a multi-site thing is going to require a lot of funding. It's going to require a lot of organization, and people want to do the quick and dirty studies. That's all that's valued. It really feels like, especially if it's not funded. So our priorities have to change.
I mean, do you think in 5 or 10 years' time that will be possible, or are you just going to hit a brick wall all the time?
Well, I think people have to take the mantle on. SPR could take the mantle on. We have to have people that are willing to do it, who say this has to be done.
All right.
Yeah, otherwise, it's just not going to get done.
Sure. How frustrating.
Yes, totally frustrating.
I feel for you.
But
Yeah,
you know, until the last issue of the handbook, it wasn't even addressed. So, you know, it's like you know, we look at psychotherapy and then think, well, of course, training, there's been an assumption in graduate programs, we don't need to train people to be supervisors. That's recent. So.
Yeah, and I don't have anything all that profound to add, but I think, you know, people work in silos and they can manage things in their silos, but to look at somebody else's silo and say, maybe we should get our silos together, at least in the United States. I'm not sure what the culture or climate is like for that in the UK or elsewhere in Europe. That, you know, it doesn't happen, which is absolutely unfortunate.
Yeah, I mean, given how central we all would say training and supervision is, it is quite amazing that it just hasn't gained a fundamental plank in the research agenda, really, nationally and cross-nationally, really.
There's also probably a threat to all of us that, you know we do well when we train people, but we don't want anybody to look at it too much because, you know, maybe we're wrong. Maybe we're not training people very well.
So I think Wolfgang.
Yes, I have a somewhat related question. We have now in Germany, we have recently a change in the training procedure, in the structure, and it moved from 3 years postgraduate. So I know most of your research is undergraduate and graduate students, but in Germany for us, you do first undergraduate, graduate students, so it's 5 years, and then the debate is postgraduate. You get license after then additional 3 years postgraduate at the moment, and now we have it to 5 years. So it was almost doubled the amount of hours students have to take, and there was quite some debate because it will be very difficult for students to do still a PhD at that time. So it's a very different and new, very challenging situation, especially because it's not funded. But I mean, from your research in this way, I mean, I remember saying to the responsible people, saying, well, you know, there is no empirical evidence that 5-year full-time training is better than 3 years, and then they said, well, you know, there's also no evidence for 3 years, which is really funny argument. But anyway, I wonder if there's anything from your experience and research where you can, on this very practical level, because in the end, if we do not have that research, there are decisions, or there are decision bodies who regulate clinical training, and you described it yourself with Clara in terms of the competency scores and the requirements in the US. But I was just wondering if there are any recommendations you can give, or any ideas from your research and your research experience over so many years on the topic for these kind of situations and discussions.
You know, I think unfortunately, maybe somebody else has a better answer to this than I do, but I think we all have to shout loudly if we have a chance, because I think most of us, me particularly, I will say, I get into doing the research and I don't go the next step to advocating what needs to happen politically, because I don't like politics, and I think a lot of us are in that situation. But we need people who will do the political end of it. Maybe other people have a better answer.
Juan Cruz, yeah.
Well, thank you, Sarah and Clara, for your presentation. I'm afraid this might sound like a bit of a cliche question at the moment, but I was thinking of what we were talking before the webinar, and how you think, what's your personal intake on ChatGPT and other artificial intelligence forms, and how this might impact the future of training undergraduate, graduate, even self-taught personal skills, or even for supervision level. How do you think this might pan out in the not so long future?
I think the immediate thing is in terms of training beginning level people, or actually one of the things in the US is when people take their postgraduate licensing exam, I think the second part of the exam is now going to be with avatars. And in medicine, they do a lot of work with standardized patients. I think the trend is going to be, let's just use avatars and see how people interact with avatars, and that'll be the proof that they can do the skills, or they can do working with clients. I think that's going to be the future. And I think that's one little piece of it. I think it's nice to see if you can interact with an avatar, but I really, and maybe it's my bias coming from years of working with people, but I think what makes a bigger difference is the unpredictability of working with a real client. Because with a real client, you see how a real person interacts. So I think the avatars, just like responding to a written statement, can be helpful. It can be a useful way of training. I'm really nervous about using avatars as the prediction of whether people are competent.
Yeah, I think it's still, I mean, we're still in the infancy of that, and just trying to wrap our head around what is it, much less how can we, excuse me, how can we use it in a helpful, productive, effective way? And it, you know, as we're talking about it, it sounds like the modern day version of analog designs earlier. So you respond to as like a scripted client, or as Clara was saying, a piece of text. And I don't know. I'm very curious. I think it has, both in medicine and also in our world, it has some tremendous potential, but I also have some concerns about it. So.
Yeah, if you really think about the evidence that we have, that it's a therapeutic relationship that makes a big difference. Now, that research has hugely problematic too. I mean, what is a therapeutic relationship after all? But if it is, we do have that evidence, and then you do it with an avatar, where's the relationship?
Right. And I don't know enough about, you know, is the avatar able to respond in the moment, or is it, I mean, how?
With artificial intelligence, they will. Remember the old ELIZA program that they did years and years ago? People loved it because the therapist was actually pretty good at responding back on a paraphrasing level.
Right.
So I think a client could be pretty good at responding back because they base it on thousands of transcripts.
Right. Yeah.
But it's still not a human being.
Nope, it's not. It's too predictable, maybe.
I don't know. We'll have.
Okay. Louis, you've got your hand up. You're muted.
Well, thanks a lot, Sarah and Clara. This was fantastic. A question that kind of follows what Michael was asking with regard to large studies, as well as part of your response about this, Clara. And I'm wondering if one of the reasons why it's so difficult to do these type of studies is, of course, the tremendous amount of variation that is taking place with each program. Even if we restrict ourselves, let's say, to, because I know it in North America, let's say we just restrict ourselves to a PhD, even if we restrict ourselves to only, let's say, clinical as opposed to counseling, or there's tremendous amount of variations, how much people are exposed to clients, when they are exposed to clients, the type of supervisions that they are receiving, etc. But I'm also wondering if in some ways, when we think in terms of the impact of training, in some ways that we're not too narrow, that we immediately be thinking in terms of the outcome of the client. And, you know, I supervised formerly for many, many, many years, and it was quite clear to me that at different phase of the graduate student's development, the dependent variable were much more large or broad than only the client's outcome. For some clients, for some therapists at the beginning of their career, when they were working with particularly tough clients with personality disorder, I didn't think that the outcome of the clients in terms of the decrease of the distress was the only thing to take a look at. So I'm also wondering if in part of the difficulty is we also needs to be quite clear, not only in terms of the theory, in terms of standardizations of what the training should look like, but also to really think very hardly in terms of what should we be aiming at different phase of the treatment and what dependent variable should be we using about that. So I'm curious about your thoughts on this.
You're absolutely right. There's so many. I mean, I think that's part of the overwhelming part of it. There's so many things that this affects. Taste conceptualization ability, theoretical orientation. There's just, yes. Would be great. I mean, I'm thinking as you were talking, Louis, because this comes back to a few conversations we've had, you know, the supervision and training section of SPR could take this on, basically going back to Michael's point. You know, that's actually one of our goals when we had started that project before, was we ought to do looking at in session things, how people actually act rather than self-report. The supervision and training section could take this on and highlight it and perhaps get funding from SPR and Division 29 and CEPI as a start and do some of this stuff. Yeah, but sitting down with a lot of smart people and saying, what are the outcomes we should be looking at every step would be so exciting, wouldn't it?
I see Gerhard, got your hand up.
First, I want to thank for this wonderful presentation. I'm talking from a training director perspective of Germany. We had very nice results in doing a first a qualitative study and asking trainees about their experiences and supervisors as well. And then we asked, I think, 275 trainees about their perspectives on supervision and what they experienced. And it was really interesting results based on a qualitative approach and then taking it in a kind of mixed method design to a quantitative explorative design. And I'm asking myself why this more basic research, what happens in supervision, what do supervisees experience in supervision? Are there so-called critical incidents, bad experiences or very good experiences in supervision? I think this should be more emphasized, and I would also argue that the qualitative methodology should be allowed to contribute to our understanding of supervision.
Absolutely.
I couldn't agree with you more. I'm 99.9% a qualitative researcher, so I completely agree. I think that's how you get inside these phenomena and inside these processes and experiences. But again, there are some culture battles here, and how qualitative research is received in the United States, I think, is very different than it is elsewhere in the world. I think the environment is much more friendly for qualitative research elsewhere. But I couldn't agree with you more.
Another aspect that came up thinking about this is qualitatively, I had a clinic and the students in the clinic were with the same supervisor for sometimes one person up to 5 years. And how different that is than typical supervision, where sometimes people have 2 or 3 supervisors at the same time for a semester, and then they hop on to somebody else, and how difficult that transition is versus long-term supervision. And some of our therapists, long-term supervision, were able to grow a lot. So that's one of the things you can get at qualitatively that you just can't get at quantitatively.
Okay, I can't see any more questions. So given we're nearing the kind of hour, I'm just going to steal one last question, which was, certainly, Clara, you made a big emphasis on practice. Yeah, practice. And I never heard the phrase deliberate practice. And I'm just wondering, is that deliberate or...
Yes. Because I don't think necessarily deliberate practice is the only thing that's important. Sure. I mean, I did a study with Tony Rosmonier on deliberate practice, so I'm quite familiar with it. Sure, I don't think it's just deliberate practice. I think it's practice. And, the deliberate practice is very strict. You do 20 minutes a day, looking at exactly what you do. And I don't think that's necessarily necessary. I think it's really practice. I had one dissertation student who talked about, her dissertation was all on looking at what therapists learn from clients. There's all these things you'll learn from just doing it. And I think you far more learn from that than anything we do in training or supervision. So it's really the practice, trying out. You observe the effects of your interventions immediately, which also is, as you know, one of the big things. I think that's where we need to look at the effects, in the immediate impact.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't think deliberate practice. I think there's many kinds of practice. Deliberate's one. And students actually get very bored with just the deliberate practice.
Yeah.
We have one more question in the chat though. Yeah.
Oh, can you deal with it, Wolfgang?
To both Clara and Sarah, is anybody aware of any client outcome evidence base for preferring individual over group formats in the training supervision of psychotherapy skills programs? Beyond ideological preference, there's the consideration of cost-effective use or training resources.
No. The easy answer is no. But I think they're really very, very different creatures. The group, the individual, and the peer, and the informal. I think there's 4 different kinds of supervision. And they really have, I mean, in our clinic, we did individual and group, and students loved both for very different reasons. One of the things you get in group is the possibility to do case conceptualization and modeling that you don't get as much in individual. So I think they just have very different impacts. But no, I know of no research on it, and no measures for sure. It probably is going to come out, though, if you look at the group versus individual psychotherapy, not a whole lot of differences. I mean, it's so difficult to get at the nuances of outcomes when you're, you know, they're both great, all of one. So, you know, it's going to be hard to get at, but I think people really value both.
Okay. If there's no more questions, I think we'll kind of bring it to a close. I'd like to extend a huge thank you to Sarah and Clara. I mean, the thing which impresses me is just your enthusiasm. You know, I mean, it's a bit like you were saying, students can read the stuff and it's nice and whatever, but actually in the same way that they respond to the live, the same, I think, in this sort of webinar, it's when you hear you talk about it and enthuse about it, it just really is so impactful. So a huge thank you to you both. We're going to meet hopefully in Dublin and sink a few pints of the dark stuff. And then I think I'm passing the baton over to Louis, who is going to be arranging the next sort of cluster of webinars. So all those people who wrote chapters, be on the lookout for an email from Louis. In the meantime, huge thanks again, and hopefully see you all in Dublin.
Thank you.
Thank you all.